Our guest today is Ollie Bray, and that's really important because it's Education Scotland and it's Creative Scotland that sponsor this programme of Creative Conversations. And we're really keen to maintain that link and that partnership, particularly because they're still deciding on our funding for this year, and we're keen to make sure we're in their good books. So delighted, Ollie, to have you here. I'm also absolutely delighted because you're making, I think, a really significant contribution to the whole culture of Education Scotland by doing events like this. The willingness to come out, to engage with people who are less predictable than some of the other people that you might find yourself engaging with, being prepared to answer questions that haven't been prepared in advance and that you know will be open and challenging. I think that's hugely valuable, and I think it's what will make a difference in terms of the nature of discussions. We've got a national discussion that's underway just now, and already we've got concerns about how controlled that will be, how genuinely open it'll be. We've got concerns expressed about the nature of the reform programme and who's involved in all of that. So for you to come out and simply say, ask me your questions and I'll answer them, I think is a massive step forward, and I hope a significant reassurance to people that there is a genuine commitment in the senior areas of Education Scotland to try and move things forward in a way that encourages colleagues and takes colleagues with you. So thank you for that. I should also thank you, Ollie, because you're as close as we have to a regular guest. I think the only person that rivals you in terms of these conversations is Howell Roberts, and he's practically been joined at the hip for these conversations. You've done several with us. And the last one, I think, we got you to come when you were director of play for Lego, but by the time you actually arrived, you'd moved to Education Scotland. So we kept the play theme. You were director of play there. We kept that theme. And one of the things that you did for us in that conversation was that you defined play and you made links from that definition into the whole issue of wider pedagogy. And I think it might be good just to start off this conversation by revisiting that and see where your thoughts are on all of these issues now.
Well, first of all, thanks, David. And it's always good to see you both virtually and in real life when our paths do occasionally cross. And I was thanks for the opening remarks on it. And this sort of genuinely is important for me to sort of come along and to engage in these events. And I'll try and be as open and transparent as I can always be in these sessions. Obviously, with a slight caveat that I'm trying to make sure that I've still got a job at the end of it as well as we go forward. But you know that you can sort of rely on me to sort of certainly give my view on things, and then if that's sort of slightly different to the Education in Scotland view, I'll maybe sort of try and explain that and exemplify that as well. And actually, it's funny because I was reflecting on the first time that we had one of these conversations as part of the creative conversation, and it's actually over 10 years ago now, which makes me feel like really old. And I think that was a physical one in Edinburgh, and I actually kind of went back to look at some of the things that we were talking about then, and it was about kind of school builds and the use of technology for kind of creativity and all of that, and some of that early conversation from 10 years ago kind of reassured me a little bit in terms of how far we've gone, but also at the same time it made me think, boy, we've still got a long way to go with some of these kind of recurring persistent issues that we've got within the system, and hopefully there'll be a chance for us to pick up on some of that later on. So the last time that I think I was here chatting about this, I think I'd literally just started back at Education Scotland. I think I was a couple of weeks literally in the door around that, and I think folks on the call will probably know that that I was at the Lego Foundation for about 2.5 years as the director of collecting play in education, and before that I was head teacher at Kingussie High School in Highland, and before that had done a number of different roles in East Lothian. And you're right, I was talking about play, and I'm just sort of trying to recall and sort of go back in my mind now are probably the sorts of things that I talked about there before sort of answering your question about how the sort of things link together. So I suspect that if I was talking about play, normally the angle that I would go down there is around kind of sort of three big themes really. So first of all, I believe that play has got certain characteristics. and I would describe those characteristics as being play as an experience where it's actively engaging for young people or indeed adults. And it's important to remember that play is not just for children and young people. That I think that play is socially interactive in nature. You can play by yourself around that, but actually most forms of play tend to be sort of socially interactive in nature, tend to be meaningful for the person that's participating in that play. I would say that it's kind of iterative in nature, like that play tends to evolve over time. Different forms of play evolve over time, and of course, it's got to be joyful, for the person that's taking part of that as well. And I probably would have mentioned this last time, is that I think there's a big difference between the words fun and joy. There are probably would have maybe sort of used the analogy before, is that if I go out for a run, the last thing that is it's fun, like I want to be sick like after getting a few minutes into it, but when I get to the end and I've achieved something, that's kind of a joyful experience. That the sort of feeling, David, that I want to kind of feel when I get to the end of this conversation around that. So there might be bits of it that are a bit uncomfortable and hard to hear, but at the end of it, hopefully I've done a good job and I'll feel that kind of sense of achievement. So those characteristics, I suppose, like in reverse order, would be it's joyful, it's iterative in nature, it's meaningful, it's socially interactive, and it's actively engaging. And actually, these are characteristics of play. And when I certainly sort of work with teachers and head teachers, both in the Lego Foundation and Kingsley High School before that, I would often say, well, this actually gives us a really good conceptual framework for the characteristics of a good lesson around that, or a good sort of scheme of work, or a good set of experiences that go with it as well. The other bits that I'm probably sure that I said last time is that I believe that play is on a spectrum. I think that sometimes we're really fixated by one end of it, which is this notion of free play, as in kids can do what they want, and there's a time and a place for that, absolutely, particularly in a playful environment. But also at the other end of the spectrum as well, you could kind of have play that isn't so free, play that's got rules, and structure that's kind of associated, with it as well. And I think that probably the best learning happens probably not here all the time, and probably not here all the time, but probably a bit here where young people have got kind of agency, to pursue their passions where appropriately, but they're being guided and scaffolded and indeed coached by the adults or the peers that are in the room. And the last thing I'm pretty sure that I would have said is that I think that play has got paradoxes, and there are big paradoxes between what we perceive as being play and school. And a good example of that might be structure. So quite often play is unstructured. Schools are inherently timetabled, or it might be that play in essence is quite often full of risk taking. Schools aren't risky places like a lot of the times around that. No, there are reasons for some of that, but quite often we follow certain structures. So in terms of, I suppose, where we've gone with that in Education Scotland since I've been involved in, is that we have started to take pedagogy seriously around that. I'm conscious that that's probably not outward facing like all of the time, although as I sort of look through the list of people that are on the call, I recognise a whole number of people on the call that are from the early years sector, be aware with the work that we do around play there. But in particular, the recently launched Play Pedagogy Toolkit, because what people were asking us for is the how around that. And in the conversation, David, that we were having last time, as we were thinking about, well, play isn't just for really, really young children. How do we take some of these characteristics or indeed other definitions of play, and how do we move that up the school, to use that phrase around that, and how do we get that into adulthood as well? So other things that we've been involved in since we've last spoken, and again, this is a network which has been supported by the Lego Foundation and been able to use some sort of contacts there, is looking at play beyond P1. And again, there's a lot of people I can see from Edinburgh on this call, and I recognise that, but we've got a number of practitioners from Edinburgh that are looking at, again, playful pedagogies or the pedagogy of play in other primary classrooms. And again, I suppose when we think about those characteristics of play, when we think about how does that work into the secondary school classroom, then that starts to make us think a little bit more about project-based learning, interdisciplinary learning. So again, we've had a kind of refocus on that, Education Scotland. And I think I won't talk too much about interdisciplinary learning now, because I think we'll probably get into that later on in terms of the way that we're trying to work and that culture shift that you mentioned. But again, I think all of these are important. And I suppose the last bit that I would sort of want to mention in terms of pedagogy, and then let's get into a bit more sort of discussion around that, is that since the last time that we spoke, we've been doing a lot of work at Education Scotland around sort of digital pedagogies, around that. Some of that is kind of conceptual, in nature, but coming out of the pandemic, people were wanting to understand a little bit more about what do actually kind of good digital pedagogies look like, a little bit more. So again, we've worked with the profession to sort of develop some ideas and some sort of frameworks, around that, which are practical in nature and also exemplified, which is the most important thing. So not just kind of abstract in nature around that. And I'll kind of stop there because there are other things that we're doing as well around pedagogies, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But I feel that I've talked a lot, and you like to talk as well. So you probably want to say something.
Well, I mean, one of the things I do want to say, Ollie, and I want to be open with everyone about, is that I had huge respect for you as a teacher. When you were a class teacher in East Lothian, I was always keen to see your practice, and to be fair, you were always keen to show me your practice. And I think it's valuable for people to recognise that a lot of what you're saying comes from that experience. I think there's huge debate at the moment around approaches to learning, and that debate is very warm at the moment. We've had lots of discussion around the SNP adopting the later start to formal education, the establishment of the kindergarten stage. Recently in England, well, nationwide, I suppose, in some senses, we've had the release of David Blunkett's report that he did for the Labour Party. And there's been a real classic Twitter pile-on about that, a real debate about the importance of knowledge and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of discussions in a lot of forums around this, lots of arguments for that more structured approach to the teaching of reading, for example, has been another live issue. And I guess what I'm interested in, Ollie, is all you've said about Education Scotland and pedagogy. Is that going to be echoed in the national discussion? Do we need more prescription, more direction around these approaches? And I guess also, what about curriculum? If the emphasis comes on pedagogy, what does that mean for curriculum? Because lots of people crying out for guidance around content.
So a couple of things to sort of say on there, and then keep like genuinely sort of keep me on track with this. So if I go off on a tangent and haven't answered your question, let's come back to it, because you've said a couple of things there around the national discussion and and pedagogy, and then the whole kind of curriculum part of it. So doing a bit of work just sort of recently, interestingly, around kind of pedagogy. And I think this is just an interesting point to sort of make, and folks in the chat might want to come in and challenge this, and that's absolutely fine. What's interesting is that within the Scottish context, there's very little work that's been done on pedagogy around that. Very little work after the early years. Actually, we're pretty strong on the early years around that in terms of pedagogy. Now, there's plenty of international research and Four Nations research, obviously, that have been done on pedagogy, but actually in the Scottish context, not so much. And I think we need to do a bit more of that really in the sort of Scottish context, because of course one of the challenges that's happened, I think, in kind of recent times is because of that lack of kind of research in terms of pedagogies in the sort of Scottish context, is it's, in want of a better word, it's opened up the market for people to come in and peddle their wares about versions of pedagogy which might not actually be robust in nature around that. Now, a lot of them, a lot of these ideas, I think, are good and sort of well founded and might work, but a lot of it is based on opinion and not maybe the kind of robustness that perhaps we would want in terms of what actually works around that. The other bit that I would sort of say on that, so I'll just sort of leave that as a provocation. The other bit that I kind of would say on that is that I felt for a long period of time, and it's been echoed since the last time that we spoke in Ken Mears' report, and when we get onto the sort of the reform bit, which we probably will later on, we can maybe talk on that in a little bit, is that certainly in the secondary school, and to a greater or lesser extent within the primary, people are interested in subject specific pedagogies around that and making that work. And again, I personally sort of really welcome that in terms of getting that right and making that work. But the things that I've tried to stress on with our sort of teams within Education Scotland, well, first of all, teams are small around that. I think that sometimes people think we're this huge, massive like organisation that's got all these sorts of things, but we don't have a lot of resource to be able to do these things. But what we are probably not bad at is being a kind of convening power around that. And one of the things that we've been trying to do in the recent months is to get our senior education officers for each of the curriculum areas to think a little bit more around, right, where are the networks that we've got here around that? So who's already in their subject networks, because they all have them. But then I've been sort of tried to be as challenging as possible as well. That's all very well, but who's not in your subject networks, and why aren't they in there around that? Are we doing a good enough job like in this area to sort of bring people together and to convene that? And also, I think this is really important as well, is in times of austerity, and boy, we're about to go into a really, really tricky time, like in terms of everything, in Scotland. I think we're really going to look back, hopefully, look back in 20 years' time and think about the years between 2020 and 2025, and hopefully not longer than that, as being a really tricky time, like in Scotland, because of COVID and the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis and everything else that kind of comes with it. But so in these times of austerity, how are we genuinely pooling some of these resources around partnership? Because there's, of course, a lot of great things that are going on out in schools, but there are a lot of other great things that are going on in subject associations, in various royal societies. There's a huge amount of work that's going on in philanthropy, within Scotland, but none of this at the moment seems to be kind of coordinated in any kind of logical way. And one concern that I have, David, and again, it would be great to get other folks to sort of chip into this at the end of the conversation, is that quite often in Scotland we talk about partnership, and what we actually mean by that is people sitting around the same table and talking about what they do rather than working together. And we've got to get beyond that if we're actually going to have that kind of systematic change that we want sort of going forward. So you asked a sort of question there about the kind of national discussion. And I'm genuinely not quite sure what will come out of that. I do welcome it. I have to say, and I'll park a bit of an opinion for now, but ask me about in a minute about the kind of crowded space that we've got on the reform at the moment, because that is a challenge. But what I would say is that the national discussion is obviously around the future vision for Scottish education. It's not just about CFE. It's meant to be sort of wider going than that. And there is a whole kind of section in there in the national discussion, or within the questions, which are vast, and there's a challenge within that. They are vast questions, and when they get all this information in, the analysing of that, I think, is going to be pretty tricky for both Professor Campbell and Professor Harris. But there is a question there around, our future learning. Now, I didn't design the questions for the national discussion around that. My concern a little bit, I suppose, is that's an optional question at the moment. And a lot of the main core questions are around, it's about the future vision, around that. Now, answering the future vision question is a pretty hard question to answer. And I'm just really hoping, and I would encourage people on this call to sort of get behind that question around the future learning and some of those optional questions about the future world, the future rights and other things like that, because I think these are really, really important questions. And actually, if you answer those optional questions first, that starts to give you a bit more of a vision around where we want sort of Scottish education to go, like, in my opinion, sort of taking that forward. So hopefully that's useful, but pick me up on the bits that I've not answered, or the bit we can go into a bit more detail on.
No, I mean, I think that's hugely helpful, Ollie. And one of the things you've done, which is particularly helpful, is you've highlighted the opportunity for people to join in on the chat. Unfortunately, for some reason, I can't see the chat, so I'm going to be relying on other colleagues on the call to draw my attention to anything that's come up in the chat. But you've done something for me, Ollie, which is hugely important. And you've taken us right back in to one of my real issues. And it was one that we discussed the last time. And that's about whether the answer to improving Scottish education lies in getting better consistency as opposed to systemic change. And the idea of looking at what's working. I mean, I know that, I'm prone to cliches, but one of my favorite ones is that the schools and the systems that are really successful are the ones that adapt and not adopt. So they're the ones that ask the question, what's working, and then build on that. And I think the reality is that we've got very good practice in Scotland. There are some schools which will be outperforming our national average in terms of PISA, and there'll be PISA, and there'll be some that'll be falling sadly below it. And rather than genuinely getting in and about fixing the engine, we almost seem perpetually infatuated with the idea of redesigning it. Mm-hmm. And I think you're beginning to touch on that real tension in the debate. Yes, we need to think about future learning, but if we're not saying what's happening now that we can build on, then we're imposing a huge workload on people, not necessarily for any good reason.
Yeah, I mean, again, you said so much, and I love talking to you, you know, about some of these things. So I think we're on the same page, although I don't agree 100% with all the bits. So it'd be good to get into that, you know, a little bit as well. So first of all, number one, with all my cards on the table, I'm petrified that as we go into this period of reform, we'll reform the wrong things, you know, around that, and because we'll reform the wrong things because it's really easy to take what we've got now, to rip it all up and to start again, because the starting again is the easy bit. Getting to the end of it, the book, the marathon, whatever metaphor that you want to use, that's the hard bit to sort of try and make that, you know, to try and make that work. And you know, I was exposed to an awful lot of that when I was working in the Lego Foundation, and we did a lot of work around, reform with a number of different countries, but in particular in South Africa and some parts of Brazil, where that would be what that would happen is a new Minister of Education, you know, would come in. I'm talking internationally now, not about what's happening in Scotland. A new Minister of Education would come in, a new government would come in, and everything would be ripped up, and it would start again. And it's like, well, what about the stuff that's actually kind of working well around that? The other point that you make, I think, is a really good thing. Is that you're right? Is that Scotland loves a systemic solution to things. So we've got an issue with something in this part of Scotland. Therefore, we're going to do something which might be suitable for this part of Scotland, but we're going to try and roll that out over the whole of Scotland without kind of any realistic appreciation for what's going on, you know, around that. And I'm saying that from a personal point of view as an observer around that. And this is the bit where we may sort of disagree slightly, and we can maybe get into that. Is that I do think that there's a place still for some systemic activity, but at the moment we quite often concentrate on the wrong systemic activity, you know, when we're doing that. So give you a quick example of my sort of how I'm sort of thinking about this in terms of kind of curriculum design and the work that we're doing with curriculum design at the moment. So I'm sort of quite focused on, in this period of we don't quite know what's happening next, because we're still waiting for all of these reports to come in, and then we need a plan and budget and all those sorts of things, to make sure that what we've got now is the best it possibly can be around that. And actually, I believe what we've got now has got the potential to be pretty good if it's interpreted in the right way. And of course, that's one of the biggest challenges, you know, of curriculum for excellence. And I say that having been head teacher and having, I think, done quite a good job at that, and seeing young people at Kingsley High School certainly thrive, and then taking a great deal of reassurance from a whole number of other sorts of schools in Scotland that have been away and taken those models of curriculum and adaptability, but change them for their own kind of local need, rather than sort of trying to retrofit them, you know, around that. So in terms of where I think that kind of systemic activity could be, is I think that there's a place for, you know, systemic activity around increasing the capacity, you know, within the system in a kind of more sort of structured way, or give an opportunity for people to do that around curriculum design around that. And that's actually kind of what the OECD, you know, was saying in one of their recommendations, you know, around that. So it's not, so it's given the time and the space for curriculum design, you know, and some parameters like where that can happen, but most importantly, showing people the art of the possible. Now, where I think then we sort of sometimes get this wrong is having the sort of the procedures in place in terms of what works. And I, for a long time, you know, have thought a little bit, you know, about this around sort of like four areas if we're trying to develop something. So we're doing a bit of work at the moment around this, around interdisciplinary learning, and again around the learner journey. So so first of all, you need to explore it. So you need to explore actually what do we mean by that, around that. And I think in the past, if I go back 5 years or 6 years or whenever it is, I'm just trying to pick a distance which distances me appropriately. Education Scotland would have gone away, and we would have explored, and they would have explored it, and they would have said, we've got the expertise in this, we've explored it. Now that's not right if you're trying to develop the whole system. And what we should be doing there, and what we're trying to do now with the sort of teams around this, is if we're going to explore something, you explore that with the people that are the best in that across the whole of the system. So in the work, for example, that we recently did with we've been doing interdisciplinary learning, and then we're just reconvening this group, we've kind of gone out to local authorities, and again there can be criticism of this sort of model as well, but gone to local authorities and sort of said, right, who's your best person in terms of interdisciplinary learning? Not who's responsible for it, like in terms of the local authority or in terms of the school that's on some kind of SMT remit, but who's the best person in the local authority for interdisciplinary learning? And let's try and get all of these 32 people together with a few other people that have got expertise in this as well. And let's actually then explore what we mean by this, so that then we can move to the next stage of the model, which is the definition. So what's the kind of co-created definition of that, which is then, in my view, owned by the system. And when we've been producing like some of the sort of the thought papers recently, we recently just put one out and commissioned one around the kind of the 4 capacities, and there was a reason for that. We might get into that in a minute as well. Is that the point is that's owned not by Education in Scotland, it's owned by the people that contributed to that, and that's powerful, like within it as well, and it brings credibility, you know, to it as well. We should be the facilitators in bringing this group together, not the experts in it, because we're not the experts, you know, in doing that. So once we've explored it and we've defined it and we've got some kind of definition people could go to, then I think it gets into the sort of stage of, right, well, what does that look like in practice? So this is then around kind of exemplification, and when I'm talking about exemplification, I'm not talking about dull case studies which you can find thousands of, like on the on the web, or long documents around that. I'm talking about actually how can you exemplify the same thing in different ways. So how can you exemplify something as a picture, as a sentence, and if people are interested, how do you get to the depth of that, you know, behind that? And our curriculum stories project we've been playing with and we published last year is just an example of how you can do that and sort of bring that together. And then I used to talk about the word empower, which is the next sort of stage of the model, but I need to sort of think of a new word for that, because that's got different meaning now, like in Scottish education. But what I really mean by that is that you've explored it within the system, so it's got credibility. You've defined it around that. We've agreed on that definition with the system. We've exemplified it with different examples of how it works in different places: small schools, big schools, urban schools, rural schools, in different ways, in an accessible way. And then how, when I get that empower, but how do we then provide the schools with the tools to unpick those examples, to make them appropriate for their own local context and their own local kids, you know, around that? So what are the schools really around kind of service design or design thinking, or whatever you want to sort of particularly call that, to be able to do that? And then, so again, as part of that, you know, we've got now, you know, available a simplified version or draft version of what we call the kind of curriculum design toolkit to help people kind of get into this. Now, you'll probably be thinking, David, and there'll be other people on the call that are sort of thinking, well, we haven't heard a lot about some of this stuff, and it's just kind of there, and it's hidden on the Education in Scotland website, which is the hardest to navigate website apart from Ryanair around that. And you'd be right about that. And that's because actually there's been quite a bit of a soft launch to a lot of these things. So as people have approached us for some support of curriculum design, we've been putting it out there. And again, that's been quite important to us over the last sort of 12 months, because I don't know about you, but there's been a lot of other stuff that's been going on over the last sort of 2 years where people have felt overwhelmed, and you can summarize that in one word, which is survival around that. So whatever you're doing in that kind of period of time is what you need to do, and that's absolutely right for the children and young people going forward. But we've got these other bits in there now that can help people as and when they kind of sort of feel ready for them. And I'm hoping that some of these tools and that way of working that we've done, which is really around co-design, which is what Ken talks about in his report. Now, we were doing this before Ken reported on that. Is I think the way that we need to go as we start to, you know, get into the sort of the next stage of the reform and develop the curriculum, you know, as a system going forward.
And I really like lots of that. I mean, I guess a couple of things. You know, one of my frustrations is that we never actually finish anything.
Yeah.
And at the moment, the only place you can find more reviews than Scottish Education is TripAdvisor. You know, I mean, seriously, we have reviewed so often. It's incredible. And it's a response, isn't it, to say, well, you know, let's get somebody else in to have another look at this and review it. And sorry, if I may just say, you know, one of the problems with that, I think, is that stuff gets lost, Ollie, and there's something hugely important for me around what you're talking about. There is brilliant stuff out there. You know, there was a really good report done ages ago on higher order skills, it was called. Gone. We have a creative learning plan. I've yet to find more than 2 people in any room that I work in that have actually read it. We've had working parties on the creative learning plan, which have laboured mightily and produced, as far as I can see, nothing. And as a result, we don't capitalise on the Labour. And part of that, and Damien Hayes is making the point in the chat, part of that is because we don't say to people what it's safe to stop and what it's safe to ignore.
Yeah.
And we're losing perspective around that. And the casualty of that, I think, is the valuable, productive and helpful stuff that you're referring to. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think so first of all, I think, I mean, you're right about the reviews, you know, around like around that. I mean, there's just so many of them, isn't it? I went through a stage when I sort of came back to education in Scotland about sort of 18 months ago, rereading the reports and seeing that, and I started to count up the amount of recommendations that were coming from the reports, and then I got a bit confused between recommendations and considerations, and now we're into the paradigm of principles, aren't we? So everything's got kind of principles that's kind of associated with it. And I'm sort of saying these sort of things tongue in cheek, because actually I do, there's a place for review, and there's a place for reports, and there's a place for recommendations around that. But I'm up to 50. I'm up to 50 now around that. I was pleased that Ken produced 17, which is a sort of slightly different number, but that actually sort of fitted in perfectly with getting to 50. And it was easy to kind of remember, you know, as part of that. And again, I'm sort of, you know, joking a little bit with it, but we do keep moving on, and we forget, I suppose, at the moment in terms of reform, that what's at the kind of the heart of the reform. And honestly, I think if we go back to that original OECD report, I'm not talking about the one from 2015, I'm talking about from the one that was produced in June 2021. People talk about the 12 recommendations that were within that, or, you know, or they don't in lots of places, but there are 12 recommendations within it. What people don't talk about is the nuances of chapter 5 within that report, where the OECD and the international experts, which we've paid, you know, have clearly unpicked what they mean by each of the different recommendations as part of that. And we need to get into that bit a little bit more in terms of what's happening before moving on to the next stage to do it. The other bit that I'd kind of want to say, and this is where we've got to be a bit careful, I think, sometimes with the reports and recommendations, is that, and you could do this yourself, like you could pick one of the recent sort of the reports that came up and think about, well, what's the interdependency between the recommendations? Because that's an important thing, you know. So if government or if an organisation chooses not to follow through with one of the recommendations, what's the impact of that on the other recommendations? And quite often what that would mean is the other recommendations, actually, they can't be implemented, you know, around that. So there's an ecosystem that's kind of put in, you know, around these things. I think that's the kind of important point. The other bit is that there's been so much talk really around, I guess, the sort of the reform agenda at the moment. Remember, we've had that OECD report in June 2021. That was quickly followed by Stobart around that. That was quickly published by, you know, a Scottish government sort of response to that, like a first version of the implementation plan. That led to Ken's consultation and then Ken's report, you know, around that. We've got the parallel work then with Louise Hayward, then we've got the national discussion going on. And then on top of that, you've got an independent review of land-based qualifications being led elsewhere within government around that. Sounds a bit like qualifications to me, or like around that. And they are talking to each other, and that's good, but it's duplicating the piece of work. You've got the review of the skills delivery landscape, you know, which has just kind of been launched. All of these things reporting within, you know, a month of each other, and then you've got other big sort of projects that are kind of ongoing, you know, out of economy and other things that have got that are incredibly important to education going forward. And I say all of these things, and the reason I mention all that sort of crowded landscape is because it's no wonder then that you could forget what I might describe as being the really, really important things, like the Angela Morgan review, like the Promise, and like UNCRC, you know, because actually all of these other sort of bigger recommendations overlay those. So we've got to find a way of navigating this. And well, we've known each other for a long time, and you know that I'm a bit of an optimist, you know, around that. I think you once called me naive, but I like to think I'm an optimist around it. But you know, I would like to think, genuinely like to think, that once we get to the end of this next bit, as in we get the Hayward review, we get the results of the national discussion, I'm going to throw the skills bit in the mix there as well, because I think that's important, like around that, and it will all kind of report at the same time, which is March. Surely then we can pull together like a coherent plan for what happens next. And when I'm talking about a coherent plan for what happens next, there's one bit of the OECD paper which really resonates with me, which says that in all, and I'm paraphrasing, it says something like what is needed here is not a traditional policy implementation. So it's not recommendation 1, Education Scotland, recommendation 2, School to Scotland, recommendation 3, David Cameron. It's right, actually, coming back to that partnership bit, how are we going to work within the system to be able to kind of take this forward in a clear and coherent, but also longitudinal way? And we've got to accept that actually reform takes time around that, and we need to kind of take on some of the challenges that we've got now immediately, but also be in this for the long game, I think.
I think it's interesting to see what's coming in from other people, Ollie, and Damien Hayes come back in again with, can we have some more just clarity about what it is we're working towards? And then I think some consistency around that. Classic example being that we had the 4 capacities, but we only examined 1. So as a result, we finished up with 1 capacity and some stuff that folk could pretty much do if they liked. And I think that's where the work that Louise Hayward is doing is critical. But as you say, at some point we need to stop and put the pieces into a jigsaw, show folk the picture on the front of the box, and then say, right, what is your role going to be in achieving the realization of this? And that seems to be kind of what you're working towards. I think a lot of the rhetoric that you're coming out with, I think, is very much moving in that direction. And again, speaking of optimism, Ollie, we've got people, Wendy Mackay, for example, coming in saying that this is a good time to move forward because people have had such a shock. COVID has had a real impact in people's pedagogy. There's a real willingness to kind of look out and learn. We've had other people coming in, saying, how do we trust the best person, for example? The criticism that's often made of Scottish education is that we finish up with the same folk in the same working parties, and joining a working party sometimes feels a bit like somebody's been taken hostage. They just disappear for a bit and then come back. So there's lots of concerns, but I think what's coming through from the chat is a real willingness to engage, and a lovely comment that what we need is to help people to get their mojo back as teachers. Do you feel we're on the way to doing that?
I think so. I mean, I'm concerned about Andy McLaughlin's comment, obviously, and obviously I've known Andy for a long time because I think we asked him to join one of the working groups, and so now I'm not sure he is the best person, but we'll take that as kind of separate around that. I do. I mean, I think. I do think there's a relentless optimism, like in Scottish education, around that. I mean, there really is, and yes, we do get frustrated, with different things. It's easy to get frustrated because of the workload and because of the challenges and because of budgetary consents and because it's all, very. There's a lot of it very, very tricky. But I've been, I think, quite sort of surprised around. I've been sort of quite surprised around I guess the kind of the enthusiasm for the sort of the national discussion part around that, and what I've been sort of trying to sort of say, and I think this is important that people in this call know this. What I've been sort of trying to say in the conversations that I have within sort of wider government is that it's great that we've got that enthusiasm, but you won't get it again, So if we're not listening and generally listening and sort of being authentic, around these things, and I do think that both Carol and Elmer have done that well around that, and they've been out and they've been doing that, and it's been good to sort of see the activities around that. We've got to listen to this, but as part of the national discussion, and what comes out of that has also got to be a bit of clear guidance around the how, as in what next, when, and how do we sort of take that further, because we will run out of that optimism, at some point, and that will become almost impossible to kind of rebuild, I think.
And that how part, I think, is really important. I think lots of people are critical about prescription, lots of people critical around the provision of resources, lots of debate in England around the Oak Academy curriculum. But, I think we need the safety net for people. As well as the high wire. I think that we need to ask for engagement, just as you suggest, but we need to give people clear guidance on how, for the days that they're knackered, I mean, I reckon I was a pretty good teacher, but I wasn't always a pretty good teacher. You know, in a given day, I could be a good teacher first thing in the morning, and I could be knackered by the afternoon, depending on my timetable for the day.
Yeah.
So that idea of the solidity and support with the capacity for improvisation and creativity seems to me to be the way forward. But that involves, I think, you know, some real engagement with the profession to make sure that people just don't see prescription, because that's what happened. You know, classically, I always remember with Higher Still in Scotland was based on the Howie Report. If you took the Howie Report and you took the comments that people made about the Howie Report in the consultation and you put them all together, you got Higher Still. It was inexorable. And then when people looked higher still, they said, no, this isn't what we want. We can't go on like that. You know, we need to get that. And that's a point that Gillian's making in the chat, that, you know, we really do need to get that genuine involvement. How do we do it? You know, short of cloning you and getting you out constantly, talking to people and engaging people and building trust.
Yeah.
How do you do it?
And I think, I mean, just in terms of the engagement around it, I think that there are decisions that are made for whatever the reason. But I do think, you know, I do think it would have been useful, you know, to give some sort of dedicated time and space for people to be able to contribute to these different engagement activities, you know, around that. Bearing in mind that we've got 3 big ones all coming up and they're all sort of closing within that kind of period, period of time. And I think that's a real, not making excuses for that, but I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity, I would say, around that. I mean, there are some things that we've tried to do around Education Scotland, certainly around sort of trying to support teachers in terms of sort of some resources to have these discussions with the children around, you know, around that as well, because you know, again, some of the feedback that we were getting is that, well, many are confident to have this sort of type of discussion. Some aren't, and there's a lack of sort of time and resource to be able to do that sometimes. So we've pulled together some you know, some resources to help people to do that. And when I say kind of pull together, that isn't just kind of Education Scotland sort of sat in the dark room doing that. That was again with groups of teachers sort of pulling those together. And I'm trying to shift that culture and sort of move that on. And then we've tried to, I guess, sort of most recently, you know, learn a little bit from COVID and what we've done there with some of the kind of bigger online engagement events for children and young people, so that they can contribute as well, you know, to be able to do that. And I think the thing, I'm sort of digressing onto a different topic, but I think the thing that I've been really interested by is the amount of sort of folk, I suppose, that reach out to me personally. I would sort of say on this, sort of say, how do I contribute, not in my school, but in my interest group, if that makes sense. So just on a very quick call this morning with a group of teachers that are very into the use of technology, which, you know, I am, or, you know, have historically been around that, and they say, well, you know, can we contribute to the national discussion as a group? So, well, of course you can. You know, all you've got to do is sort of fill this in. And by the way, you haven't got to fill in all the questions, you know, around that. Maybe just pick the one around what does good learning look like, you know, around that, and just focus on that one. Just do what you can to sort of try and make that work.
One of the things that I've argued in the past, and I know other people that have a similar view, is that we haven't really done enough, I don't think, to encourage genuine grassroots movements.
Yeah.
So, for example, Pedagogue was a highly successful, at least initially, effort to build a kind of grassroots culture of engagement among Scottish teachers. And I think what we need, and I think what you're fundamentally talking about, Ollie, is that alliance between those with the executive power and those who are responsible for the delivery of education to young people and children. But in a sense, what we've tended to do is pick people out from that. So, you know, Fergal Kelly, who's a real driving force in Pedagogue, was taken into Scottish leadership programme did a fantastic job there, got some really good genuine engagement, but we didn't quite get that balance of how do we engage with that grassroots movement, which I think in some senses what you're grasping for is generate the energy, recognize the practice, and coordinate that so that it produces a meaningful product that people can use.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, I think I can talk about Fergal Kelly, you know, and because I know him well, work with him, and he's in one of my teams now back at Education Scotland. Is I think that some of the work that Fergal did originally around that, not just about pedagogy, but what he learned from that, and those initial teacher leadership programs, that's really, you know, what we were doing then, or what he was doing then, 7-8 years ago, whenever it was. That was Scotland's first real attempt around co-creation, wasn't it? That was actually sort of going around the country, speaking to people, forming an opinion, channeling it through Fergal and a sort of close circle, you know, of people to do it, and then producing something which is going to be useful for the system. And we need more of that. I do worry. I mean, I think co-creation is really, really important and incredibly powerful. And as you say, that's about kind of energizing the system and sort of making it work. I worry that co-creation will become the new buzzword, you know, and design thinking and service design will become the new buzzword around that, and everybody will say they're doing it, but they're not doing it well. And I think that, and again, I sort of say this a lot of the time when I'm talking at work, is that co-creation that's messy. You've got to feel that you're going to be uncomfortable with that. You've got to accept that you might not hear what you want to hear around that. Otherwise, there's no point in co-designing to start with around that. It's expensive. I think people often don't sort of think about that. Like, if we're actually going to sort of co-design something in Scottish education, teachers need time to be able to do that. People need to get out of school. You need to give that time across, you know, to be able to. You can't expect people to be doing it, you know, at 6 o'clock at night in their own time around that. So it's expensive, and because of those things, it's time consuming. It takes time. So it's got to be well planned in advance to make all these things that work. The other bit that you said, I think was really interesting, is the bit about how do we support these kind of grassroots organisations and sort of try and make them grow. And I think that we could be doing more there. And when I think back over the last 20 years, really, and the support that occasionally Learning and Teaching in Scotland and Education in Scotland and the SQA and SDS has injected into some of these grassroots organisations to sort of kind of help them grow, it's been quite good, but it's not been consistent to sort of try and make that work. And actually, I think that some of the things that we could do, and we did this a little bit in the Lego Foundation, is that sometimes you provide a bit of funding and a bit of resource or a bit of an expertise, just to put a bit of structure around these things, you know, and a little bit of kind of seed funding, just to make sure that there's a bit of sustainability, and most importantly a bit of stability, like within these bits, or to help these kind of networks grow. And I think actually that we should, as an organisation, be valuing, as I've mentioned already, sort of subject networks, like a little bit more in the work that they do. And I think that we all would recognise that some subject networks are more active than others, you know, around that. That's not a criticism, because they're all run by volunteers. But actually, if a subject network is not active, how do we support them to get active, you know, around that, to sort of make that happen? So I think there's lots that we can do there in the system to, you know, to energize it and to get things moving.
And I agree with that. And again, I think one of the things that you're touching on, Ollie, is a concern that's kind of run through a lot of this conversation, which, crudely put, is that anything you would want to see happening in education is happening somewhere in Scottish education, but certainly not everywhere, and maybe not in enough places. And there's an interesting tension around that. Again, you know, comment coming in from Linda Lees about encouraging teacher groupthink. You know, that we get this, that suddenly the whole discussion is about retrieval practice, or you know, it's about whatever the current buzz term is. And I think it's that. It's that need to build on success. I think STEP, the Scottish Teachers Enhancing Practice, is a really interesting example. They're a grassroots organisation, formerly chartered teachers, who really got alongside Scottish Government when they do a conference, they'll have the Secretary of State for Education there. They'll give them a platform, but around that, they'll have workshops which are based in practice. And there's a really interesting model there. But to the best of my knowledge, apart from myself and the STEP committee, nobody ever really talks about that as a kind of effective building block. Is that something you would sympathise with?
I think so, and I think I'll sort of take that a stage further as well. Is that how did so there's the structures behind that and the building of that, which I think is a successful model, because it's ultimately, you know, it's ultimately that combination of being politically aware, I suppose, at the same time, but also at the same time engaging in those really important questions, you know, and the conversations, you know, around it. But it's also sort of two ways. So how do you get that expertise there and actually feed that back, you know, into government? And the whole sort of premise, I think, that we need to sort of that we need to sort of think more about as we go into the sort of the next stage is the idea of, you know, curriculum design or curriculum making, you know, as some people call it, is something which is done together. And to sort of Linda's point about groupthink, is it needs to be done together in cross-functional teams some of the time to sort of try and make that work. And just to sort of take that as a little bit further, is that we're working at the moment, it's a spoiler alert, around a new national professional learning offer, you know, that will start in August next year, and it will be focused on, you know, curriculum design around that, and it will fit into the national model of professional learning, which gets good feedback. This is like our systems leadership programs, our middle leadership programs. We've got well over 1,000 people participating on the middle leadership programs this year. The racial literacy program, again, really oversubscribed around that. So it's longitudinal in nature, it's evidence-based, it's inquiry focused, so it's actually dealing with kind of local need. And we'll develop we're developing the curriculum design program around that within the kind of at the sort of the early stages, you know, of that. But one of the initial conversations is that because it's cohort based, how do you get people, you know, around this idea of kind of collectives? And actually, to avoid that bit about groupthink to start with, then what we need to be doing there is having people with sort of cross interest, but most importantly cross sector. So if you're thinking about designing the curriculum around that, and you're thinking about really trying to design a coherent 3 to 18 curriculum, then you combine somebody in the same room that's got early years background, primary experience background, you know, and a secondary subject specialist, and you bring them together to have that discussion around it, and that becomes a good sort of starting point for what you do next.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there's a lot of commonality beginning to develop, not only between the questions and the answers, but also between this conversation and the conversation that's going on in the chat. And I think part of what we're, I think, screaming out for is just some straightforward clarity. You know, it was fine in the early stages of Curriculum for Excellence. We seem to be so determined not to specify knowledge for whatever reason. And it would have been helpful to say, actually, if you're doing science, there are a few scientific laws that you should pretty much know, otherwise you're really going to struggle to do much within science. We didn't say that. And I think there's something around that lack of clarity. I think there's something around genuinely saying what's important. I mean, one of the things which I always go back to is that in Scotland, we had the building the curriculum documents. And I was involved in summarising them. And we produced 4 papers, none of which were more than a couple of thousand words, that covered everything that was in the page after page after page. We didn't promote them. Didn't promote them. We don't refer back to them. The curriculum, building the curriculum 2, which was around play in early years. The key change that we made in the reduced document was that we talked, as you did at the start of this, about the interaction of different approaches, the blending of different approaches as children moved through school. All of that stuff left neglected. And I think there's something around how do we get clarity around what it is you need to do ultimately? What are the key things you need to look at? And what are the things that what are the breakable plates, as I keep saying?
Yeah.
Do you have a view on our breakable plates, Ollie?
I agree. So I agree. I mean, I'm liking all your metaphors, apart from the one about the jigsaw, because I would have preferred the Lego set. But otherwise, all of the rest of them have been pretty good. So, so there's a couple of things of that. So first of all, you know, the documents that you were involved in kind of rewriting, you know, back at the time, you know, I mean, great pieces of work. I'm not just sort of saying that around that. I remember them sort of coming out and sort of simplifying things, but the reason I'm sort of mentioning it, because it's just another example of the system's got a problem. The solution to that is to simplify the documents. We've simplified the documents. That's the problem solved. But of course, it's not. It's about the interpretation of it, you know, around that. And we need to get beyond that. And so we need to, any of these kind of interventions that we do, it needs to be part of this kind of, it needs to be part of a wider structure for doing it. It cannot just be reactive all of the time to do that. You're right about the breakable plates around that. We're terrible at that. Like in Scottish education, around that, sort of trying to stop the bits that aren't, you know, stop the bits that aren't working too well, or stripping out content from our courses around that. Various different levels of the system, we're not as part of that. And you're absolutely right about the kind of the clarity around that. And I think, you know, one of the challenges that we've got, and we have to hope that we get into a bigger discussion, a proper discussion around this, you know, around the purposes of Scottish education, is around the purpose, which obviously we're sort of doing at the moment. So we obviously, you know, I would argue that the 4 capacities are the purpose around that. I think that probably we'll have a time where we need to accept that they maybe need to be updated, you know, around that, but we can't lose that purpose around them. And I mean, I fundamentally disagree with people that say they need to get rid of the 4 capacities, because I think that education has to have a purpose, and that at the moment gives us a purpose around that. I don't really want to also get into a situation where then the 4 capacities become a tick boxing exercise. Right? I think it's incredibly dangerous ground to get into. And I also see the 4 capacities, of course, as an input into curriculum design, like right from the start. If you start with that, and that's how you design the system, rather than that's the output, you know, from it. I suppose the other bit around that is around, you know, if you, and one way to describe it would be the sort of the technical model, you know, of CFE. So you know, were these and those the right way to go? You know, and I think if we were to kind of reflect on that now, I think that we all realise that there are problems with that, because of course, well, knowledge is mentioned, it's always mentioned in the abstract, you know, around that. So to your point, actually, it would have been handy to understand what the core areas are, you know, as part of that would have been an incredibly, you know, important thing to do. And of course, the other problem with these and those is it leads to this kind of tick boxing exercise, or people can easily sort of go down that. And then we start to measure it, but it's not designed as a measurement exercise, therefore we're measuring the wrong things. And then you get a whole accountability agenda, you know, behind that, which is, you know, not helpful. So again, you know, just to sort of take that a little bit further in terms of what might come out, I suppose, in the next stage around this, is it would be interesting to see whether there's any thoughts coming out of the national discussion, sort of building on revisiting that technical model, and perhaps actually revisiting the technical model that was suggested in the OECD report from the 2012, which is around the idea of sort of the big ideas. You know, British Columbia, I think, kind of do this well. So talking about, yeah, you've got the big conceptual ideas, but actually you've kind of got, you know, the core knowledge and the skills that are kind of associated with that. But it's got a narrative progression framework that goes with it as well, not a progression framework that's based on age and stage. You know, from that. Now, I'm not saying that that's ideal, but it's interesting that the OECD, you know, pulled that out, and I think it would give us that is something that I personally think is worth exploring, and I think it would be interesting to get into that as we start to think about other curriculum models going forward. But it's got to be done in the right way, and that can't be destroyed by bureaucracy.
Yeah, and I think there's some really important points there. I think accountability is something that we have to mention, and part of the reform will be a rethinking of the role of the inspectorate. But clearly what we've done is we've created a culture where too many people are wondering what they might do wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so what I think is we get defensive leadership, we get defensive practice, we get people who have converted themselves into owls so they can better watch their backs. And we haven't managed to instill a genuine belief that, yes, you can try things. Yes, it can be messy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, we will get things wrong. And your last comment there about the impact of bureaucratic thinking, we have fallen, I think, into that too easily. And it's just interesting to see, I think, what we might do around this whole concept of hierarchy, accountability, and assessment. Louise Hayward's review is going to be absolutely critical to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it, probably, in my view, coming out at the wrong time.
Well, there's an interesting bit there, isn't there, around whatever comes out of Louise's review. Does that mean assessment's going to drive the curriculum again going forward? Those I mean, I'm making that into a very kind of simple argument around that. Now, having spoke to Louise, is that she's very, very aware that's a challenge, and that's not what she wants. Around that. Of course, the challenge might be then that what comes out of Louise's review is the set of principles that she's been talking about before, but it's not the finished piece, which means that then we end up having to do a further bit of work sort of further down the line, and it continues and it continues. But yeah, hugely important, I think, in terms of what what comes next, and a huge appetite for assessment reform, particularly, as you would imagine, among secondary school teachers around that. I mean, there's lots we could talk about there. Like, I think that still we get in the system people getting confused between assessment and examinations around that, and to link back to a whole kind of pedagogical argument around that. My sort of view on it is that we have the curriculum, we decide on the curriculum will be, we won't get into the detail of that in the moment. We then think about, right, what's the best pedagogical principles to be able to deliver the curriculum in terms of the knowledge, skills and attributes we want children to be able to have. And then once we decide on those pedagogical principles, we can decide on what's the best way to assess the outcomes of that sort of going forward. And of course, I mean, there are some ridiculous, in my sort of view, notions that we've got at the moment where we assess some children and young people really still through a written high stakes test of which is something which is a practical or performance skill around that, and that's not right, and it shouldn't be right. But then of course it's been us as in the profession that have driven that some of the time, not everybody within it, but but people driving for a parity within academic standards around that. But that's often driven by people that don't necessarily understand the sort of subject or the context of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think that again is a really helpful contribution, because subjects, I think, like PE and home economics in a sense became over academic. I remember at one point giving the standard grade exam to the people responsible for PE in Fife, and none of them did very well in it. Because that wasn't their concept to PE, that wasn't what they'd grown up with. And that whole issue about over academicization, I think it also afflicted subjects like home economics.
Yeah, of course, and actually the assessment method as well. I mean, PE is an interesting one, and I mean, I think there's lots of aspects of PE and sort of physical education, but I find it, what I find interesting around that is that, without getting into too much detail, you've got National 5 PE, which has got no written exam, as part of it, and then you've got higher PE, and there'll be people on the call that know a bit more about this than me, which has got the second longest written exam and the papers associated there, other than English, to make that work. And there's something not quite right, between that and how that goes. And actually, the tragedy of the situation at the moment is all over Scotland, where we've got young people that are practicing writing with a pen and paper in classrooms to prepare for the exam, rather than actually sort of concentrating on the learning behind it. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that there's not a place for writing. There absolutely is around that. That doesn't mean there's not a place for examinations. There absolutely is. But at the moment, there's a lot of time where kids are actually there practicing writing. It doesn't matter what they're writing, but actually that physical ability to be able to write for 2.5 hours, which is something that I couldn't do. Now I would struggle with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd like to do at this point, Ollie, is kind of two things. And the first thing is to say to you, is there anything that you wish you'd had the opportunity to say, but you haven't had that opportunity thus far? Is there anything you particularly want to bring in at this point?
I don't think there's something around that. I mean, I'm sort of very happy to have the discussion and sort of pick up on the questions, around that. But I'm always genuinely interested in ideas that sort of people. Well, I'm always very, very happy for anybody to kind of get in contact around. That's not a problem at all. Like around all those sorts of things. But any ideas around, the work or the ongoing work, or what could be, what could be better, around that. Within the art of the possible, around that. There's obviously some things that are not within my gift, or anybody's gift, around that. But ways that we might be able to help, or ways that we might be able to support. Happy to sort of take any feedback from that, either now or offline afterwards.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would like to do is just take a pause. There have been a number of people who've contributed on the chat, and I've been getting screenshots of stuff coming up. But just to give you the opportunity, if anyone wants to raise a hand and come in at this stage, sorry, I'll lower my hand. If anyone wants to raise a hand and come in at this stage and genuinely be part of the conversation, more than welcome to do that. Somebody might need to tell me if anybody's raised a hand, but.
No hands up at the moment, David, just to let you know, but they're very welcome. I'm sure people's hands are poised to be raised, so go for it.
Thank you.
People are doing that thing, David, where actually they're no longer in the room, but they're just still on the Teams call because they're not on the video, so they're making their tea or doing whatever.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things, and I'm not ruling out the possibility of a late intervention. I think one of the things I'd want to say at this point, Ollie, is that, for me, here's Damien. Damien, do you want to come in?
I'll try. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, from the Education Scotland point of view, what capacity there is to actually make changes, because I think the teachers in my school, when they hear all these consultations coming out, sort of roll their eyes and say, "Oh, not another consultation." And we've had quite a few in just this first term, and they say things like, "This is not me. This is me reporting. Oh, they're not going to change the SQA. It's just going to be the ASQ or the SAQ or something like that, and they're not going to change Education Scotland. They're just going to reshuffle the deck chairs." So I just wonder whether, I mean, it might be that the bottom up stuff, like the Fergal Keddy stuff you've been talking about, is the way forward, because there isn't a political appetite to have a big change at the top.
Yeah, so I think there's a few bits in there. So I suppose so in terms of Education Scotland, I suppose it's around what do we want changed, around that. I mean, we're obviously sort of agents of government, really, more than anything else. So we're often tasked from government to be able to sort of take things forward from there. So it is important that we sort of try and get teachers' voice into these reviews, because then they might transfer into sort of tangible actions for us to be able to take forward. And of course, if we don't contribute to that, it might turn into actions that then we have to take forward, but we don't kind of personally or morally kind of believe in around that, but we're tasked to kind of do it. So there's that part of it. The other part, of course, is that we have got both a strong kind of curricular team now, and a professional learning team that are very happy to sort of come out and work with schools, or groups of schools around things that they're wanting to improve, I suppose, and get better. I mean, I think the point that you make about the agencies is an important one, because for me that's got to sit within the remit of the agencies, but also the way of working of the agencies. And the bit that I'm not hearing enough about at the moment is how these three agencies will all sort of work together as they move forward. And I suspect that's probably because they're not far enough sort of down the line of that, at the moment. But what we don't want sort of going forward is an education agency which is working completely independently to whatever this new qualifications agency will be, which is then completely working a different way to HMIE. Then there needs to be some kind of way for that educational ecosystem to fit together. So I'm not sure I particularly answered your question on that, but if there's anything in particular that we can help with, we're happy to do that.
I think, to be fair, Ollie, you did answer part of this earlier in the conversation, because the comment that you made earlier was, if something's important, it needs to have time given over to it.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, and I think that was a genuine response. I think we've also got Gillian with her hand up. Gillian, do you want to come in?
Yes, thanks. Hi, David. Hi, Ollie. Thank you so much for this conversation so far. I think one of the things I wanted to ask about was, and I'd put it in the comments, about how you get everybody engaged and enthusiastic to actually have that conversation. I'm really worried about teachers losing their mojo, but also about the fact that, you know, Shirley Ann Somerville said education doesn't stop at the school gate. So how do we get everyone on board to talk about this? Because it's not just about those in schools and teachers. We have a plethora of third sector organisations that are doing amazing jobs. We have, and you mentioned it yourselves, they're talking about philanthropists. There's no, you know, there's nothing out there that shows a map of all of this, so that we can have everybody, and you know, that age-old saying that says it takes a village to raise a child. You know, how do we get everybody in? I'm really keen to get everybody in and talking about it, because I think the most exciting document I've seen of late was the one from the consultation with young people, children and young people.
100%.
You know, that's the one I keep referring to.
Great, Gillian, and it's a great question. So I guess partly to provide a bit of reassurance around here, but not the answer. So apologies for that. Is that I was really well. So first of all, maybe I was a bit naive to start with. So there was a call, you know, a conference call that I sat on with Carol Campbell and Elmer Harris that had invited third sector organisations to come part to find out about the national discussion. And this is before the actual launch. So the way that they did it, and I think this is quite clever, and I want to provide a bit of reassurance here. I don't know how much this is publicly facing, but it's not confidential by any means. Is that the first groups that they engaged with were young people's groups, you know, around that. Now, could argue these are traditional young people's groups, the Young Parliament, the Young Scot, the consultation group, but they did engage with young people first, you know, around that to help shape some of the questions. And the second group was then around organisations that are involved in the wider education of children and young people. And what I said maybe I was being a bit naive is that it is I can't remember the exact number, but from memory I think there were 108 organisations on this call, on that call, which is huge, like absolutely huge around that. And again, all have been encouraged to contribute, and I know that many have been away and sort of filled in the consultation documents or worked with the young people they've got, or the other areas. There's also obviously been other you know, conversations, particularly with the kind of the parent bodies, National Parent Forum of Scotland and Connect, who are sort of doing their own events as well. So there's a genuine attempt to sort of really try, you know, around this. The bit that I suppose is a bit more sketchy, and again, I'm just sort of being really open and honest about this, is that I was sort of quite keen when I was sort of feeding a bit of advice to the original part of the national discussion, is that everything would be valid around that. So whether that was teachers having a chat in school, whether it was a formally organised group, but also if it was a group of people sat around the table on a sort of Saturday night wanting to have a chat about that, they could feed in as well. So that coffee table conversation. So when we produced the resources for that, we purposely made those coffee table resources available as well for people to do it. But I'm not quite sure, you know, how much of that has come on. Interesting, there's a big education conversation going on internationally, you know, at the moment, which it's being organised by Richard Branson's daughter. I noticed that he had one on Mount Kenya the other day, so I can't really compete with that, you know, as well. So it's interesting, different part of it. So I think we've got to try and get as many people involved as possible, and we've just got to keep letting people know that this is important.
Okay, anyone else want to come in at this stage? Oh, well, Gillian, is that your hand still up, or are you coming back?
I just want to ask one thing, Ollie, was I guess it's about the transparency of people knowing that these conversations are going on. Do you mean I'm delighted to hear that there were 108 organisations spoken to. It'd be lovely to know who they were, and to be, you know, for organisations to talk to each other about it. Is there a way of knowing those kinds of things?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I suppose. I mean, it's interesting because what you've actually asked there is a real kind of tension within the system. because of course there's I mentioned 108 of these organisations now. Some of these organisations will be doing the same or similar things, so there's a reluctance sometimes, to talk about that, or to talk across it. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, around that, but there is a real tension there around that, because I'm with you. It would be good to have these open and honest conversations about who's involved, but it's also a cluttered landscape. So sometimes, for whatever reason, the organisations maybe don't share as much as they could. It's an interesting, I think, tension we've got within the system.
Okay, Bex, do you want to come in?
Yes, thanks. Hi, both. I think what's really interesting when we're talking about this discourse is still that we are skewed around teachers, almost to the exclusion of other educators across our systems. If you're thinking about schools, we've got our PSAs, our EYPs, our janitorial support. Everybody there is part of that community, particularly if we're looking at the curriculum holistically and thinking about the 4 capacities and not just subjects. And I think that is something that we really need to widen out, because our children, our young people, are educated by all, not just teachers, and we need to recognise that hard graft, because otherwise I think we do risk going back into the kind of political philosophers of old who were able to talk about, know, highfalutin things, because all of the hard graft was being done behind the scenes and not being acknowledged.
Yeah, I don't need to respond to that apart from to say I think that you're absolutely right, and that you raise a good point, and we have to, we've all got a role in this, around that, to make sure that we're challenged around the language that we use around that all of the time. So we're not just sort of saying teachers or practitioners, but we're being really explicit with the language that we use, or being really clear around those definitions. I mean, often, when I was working, at King UC High School, I thought that quite often some of the most valuable inputs that you would get around pedagogies would be the PSAs that have been in the school, because they've been in all the classrooms all the time, and actually the musical instrumental instructors that have been working with some of these kids, from primary 3 all the way to the end of S6, when they're doing that as well, in terms of those sort of transition phases. So it's making sure that we're using all of the key adults in children's lives, and I think to us they're obvious, but to others it's not as obvious. We need to challenge that.
Yeah, interestingly, I've just not long finished doing a course, an online course on trauma-informed practice, and one of the things we very deliberately did in that was take a cross-section through a school. So we interviewed children in the school, the janitor, the PSAs, the head of learning support, and the head teacher. So we interviewed them all, because we thought that Bex's point was hugely important.
Yeah.
That, if the culture of the school breaks down at any point, it's broken. And recognising that role, I think I agree with you, absolutely critical. We've got Linda Lees with her hand up. Linda.
Right, yeah, that completely segues really nicely into what I was going to say. And Ollie, I'm glad you mentioned instrumental music, because I was actually going to say that there are the people who are in the school every single day.
Yeah.
And we absolutely, as Beck says, we need to embrace all of what they have to offer and the relationships that they have with children and young people. But I do think that we don't all really take full account of the other things that are around within education services, like outdoor learning and the staff that deliver that, the coaches, the instrumental instructors, our YMI tutors, our back to schools coordinators. These are a massive resource, and we mustn't subsume them, but we must celebrate the amazing things that they have got to offer. And it might not be sit down in front of a, or stand up in front of a class, but there's so much there. I think we need to embrace this more. And actually, when cuts are coming, which they are, so the CLD, let's think about youth work, and these are often things that become the low-hanging fruit, and they have been, and it's going to get worse. So while we've got this phenomenal resource in Scottish education, we have got to embrace it, and we've got to use it to build the resilience, the skills, and everything else that our young people are needing, because my God, the next few years and the impact of COVID and the impact of what's happening right now, we're going to see real problems. So I think it's just partly a kind of a reminder to everyone, and a plea that we don't forget all of that resource, because we're paying for it.
Yeah, 100%, and I would sort of take that a stage further as well, because it's not just about forgetting it; it's also about learning from it. As well. Like I kind of get a bit, I used to get a bit sort of fed up when I was, in school, and people sort of say, "Oh, CLD, they do a really good job," and it's like, yeah, well, they do a really good job, but do you know what they do? Around that. So where's the conversation in terms of sort of swapping the practice and exchanging the ideas, and the work shadowing of each other and sort of making all these bits. But that's what we need to make a really sort of strong system. Otherwise, frankly, kids just get past, and they often have very, very worthwhile experiences, but they're not always developed the way that we would.
Ollie, that's exactly what I mean. It's about not subsuming it and saying, right, now you come into my school and do what I tell you, but actually, my God, your practice is amazing.
100%.
I can learn from that. Thank you. Yeah, I agree.
I think this has been a really interesting conversation, and hopefully other people have enjoyed it as much as I have. I think it's thrown up lots of tensions, but one of the things that it has done, I think, is shown genuine sincerity and engagement in your part, Ollie. And I hope that that's something that people will take away from the call and recognise, and that we'll get more discussion around, because a lot of the points that have been made in the chat are about belief, about how important it is to get people willing to invest their time in any form of change or reform. And there's lots of cynicism around, there's lots of tiredness around, people not coming on the call because it's too late in the day, they're too knackered and they don't look good enough. We've had that, we've had people battling their way through storms and slow running trains, we've had all sorts of things going on. But I think you've done an awful lot with this call to open up the genuine invitation for people to engage. I think one of the other things you've done is you've thrown up one of the real tensions that we've got, because you're very clear at times about what does work and what does make a difference. We know a lot about what makes for effective change and reform, and we need to be careful, and you said this earlier, that we don't simply throw everything into the melting pot because we're having a new conversation. And what we certainly don't need to do is then pull stuff out from the melting pot on the basis that it's got a name and a label, and we then throw that up as a solution to problems. I think you've been really good in getting away from that idea that there are silver bullets. I look forward to March. I hope that by that time we will have all the bits that we've discussed, and in true Lego style we're able to put them together so that it resembles something meaningful. So a huge thank you for coming back, Ollie. A huge thanks for being so open, so energetic, and really for the clarity and content as well. So thank you very much for that, and thank you very much to everyone who's attended. We've got something coming through, and it's really just a thank you. So let's take that. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll finish the conversation at that, and we'll leave it up to you if you want to come back at a later stage, Ollie. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody.